Earlier this week, Ryan was telling me about an article he read on one of the Trump properties. It's in upstate New York, and of course the Trumps haven't been there for a few years, but it has like 60 rooms and 3 swimming pools and a bowling alley. And thinking about that reminded me of a piece I had heard on NPR earlier about the most expensive things you can buy in restaurants, the most expensive menu items, one of which was $1,000 sundae, and this thing has like caviar and gold leaf, and of course you get to keep the crystal dish that it's served in. But Trump's 28,000 square foot mansion, which he claims is 50,000 square feet for some reason, but however big it is, it has nothing on the 400,000 square foot home in Mumbai, India. It's called Attila. You know, if you name a house, it's pretty fancy. It's valued at $1 billion. This thing has a 168 car garage, a whole level. It's a skyscraper. A whole level is like a health center, a gym, has 3 helipads. It has a theater inside that seats 50 people. And these poor schlubs eating their $1,000 sundaes clearly can't afford the $14,500 stilt fisherman indulgence, which is an Italian cassata dessert with Irish cream and a champagne base. And oh, it also comes with an 80-carat aquamarine stone, just, you know, for aesthetics, I guess. Jesus in the parable says this rich man feasted sumptuously every day. And I don't know if we're talking about $1,000 sundae kinds of feasts or $14,000 Italian cassata feasts, but it's clear that this rich man in the parable is not just kind of rich. He is the elite of the wealthy. He feasts sumptuously every day. He wears purple, which in that time was very rare. I found out that they made the purple dye from these little snails. You can imagine how many snails it would take to get the dye to dye an entire outfit in purple. So he is one of the extremely wealthy, top of the heap kind of people in Jesus' day. And as this man is feasting in his purple clothes, at the gate we have Lazarus clothed in sores, who is starving, literally starving. We know, of course, that the world is not made up of multi-thousand square foot mansions and $1,000 desserts. Over 600 different people used the Lawrence Emergency Winter Shelter over the past few months when it was so cold. And I've heard of 3 people who died from lack of shelter during the nights. I recently heard a pastor talking about how some of the unhappy people in his congregation know the schedules for when restaurants dump out food and regularly eat out of dumpsters. Apparently Little Caesars has a certain time of day they throw away some old pizzas, and one of this pastor's church members eats Little Caesars a couple times a week, but also reports there are other restaurants that guard the trash cans or lock them away or ruin the food before it's thrown out so that those who are starving at the gate can't even eat the scraps from the table. And the story that Jesus tells us brings these 2 worlds of the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor together in one visual, one literary image of Lazarus at the gate of the rich man. Within the first 3 verses of this parable, we are challenged with this great wealth disparity, this chasm that's presented in the earthly world before we even get to the chasm in the afterlife. And in thinking about the uninhabited Trump mansion and the expensive desserts and the 168-car garage. It reminded me of an experience I had years and years ago when Ryan and I were fairly newly together, and we had been talking about his parents and their wealth because they were adding on to their lake house. After their kids moved out, they were adding on to their lake house, and we were just talking about money and wealth. And then we went with his parents to have a meal with Ryan's aunt and uncle. And then I remember after that, Ryan's parents talking about how wealthy his aunt and uncle were. They had more money than Ryan's parents did. And I realized that these are conversations that people must always have. I mean, there may be 2 or 3 people in the world who don't look to someone who has more than them and who can't say, oh, but that person is really rich. So while this parable is about someone very wealthy, I think that we miss the point if we read it as a story that is only directed to or only applicable to those who have extreme wealth, because depending on what scale we're using and what context we're talking about, many of us are wealthy people in some sense. We have resources beyond what we need to live in the world. So this parable holds a message for all of us who have shelter while others lack it, for all of us who sit down to 3 meals a day when others go hungry, for those of us who are well cared for while others lack health care. In his sermon on this parable, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asks, what then were the sins that led to Dives' damnation? And Dives, as a side note, is the name that's traditionally been given to the rich man. It just means rich in Latin. But it's interesting and worth noting that Jesus does not give the rich man a name. He only gives Lazarus a name. But King is asking, what are the rich man's sins? And he lays out three things. First, he says Dives' overabsorption in self prevented him from seeing others. He passed Lazarus every day, but never really saw him. Secondly, says King, Dives was condemned because his selflessness caused him to lose the capacity to sympathize. There's nothing more tragic than to find a person who can look at the anguishing and deplorable circumstances of a fellow human being and not be moved. Dives' wealth had made him cold and calculating. It had blotted out the warmth of compassion. He saw men hungry and fed them not. He saw them sick and visited them not. He saw them naked and clothed them not. Finally, says King, Dives' greatest sin was that he accepted the inequalities of circumstance as being the proper condition of life. There are certain gulfs in life, says King, which originate in that accident of circumstance. So in the parable, Lazarus was poor not because he wanted to be poor, but because tragic circumstances had made him so. And on the other hand, Dives was rich because fortunate circumstances made him so. There's a circumstantial gulf between Lazarus and Dives. Now, Dives' sin was not that he made this gulf. The sin of Dives was that he felt that the gulf which existed between him and Lazarus was a proper condition of life. Dives felt this was the way things were supposed to be. And I love King's articulation of these sins because I think it points us to 3 important things that we need to attend to in our own spirits and our own lives: to attention, compassion, and justice. First, we're called to pay attention, right, to the people at our gate, or the people holding signs up in the parking lot, or the people camping along the levee, or the people getting food at Link. To pay attention to all the people that God puts in our path, not just the people that make us comfortable, that we feel like talking to. Second, we're called to compassion. And this flows from paying attention. Or it can, and it should, right? When we pay attention to people, then our hearts are opened in compassion for them. And that compassion necessarily leads to action, to feeding the hungry, to tending to the sick, to visiting the imprisoned and the lonely. Sometimes, at least for me, I think I'm hesitant to open up to compassion because the needs are so overwhelming. I don't know where I would start to address some of the need that I see. And I'm afraid once I start, I won't know how or be able to stop. Just as the rich man is not condemned for his failure to feed all the hungry people, though, so also we don't bear responsibility for all the world. We're not called to do everything. We're called to do something. And finally, there's this question of justice that King talks about. He references Reinhold Niebuhr saying that the rich man took the isness of circumstantial accidents and transformed them into the oughtness of a universal structure. Right? The man took the isness and made it into an oughtness. And I like this idea, or that wording. The rich man thought that he deserved to be rich, that the fact that he was rich meant that he ought to be rich, that he deserved to be rich, and that the fact that Lazarus was poor meant that Lazarus deserved to be poor, that he ought to be poor. And we have seen this mentality. We see this mentality all over the place and throughout U.S. history. U.S. slave owners insisted that Black people deserved to be enslaved, that the isness, the reality of slavery meant that there was an oughtness, that people from Africa deserved somehow to be enslaved, or that white people deserved somehow to be masters. We see this with treatment and attitudes towards women. I just read this week Albert Mohler, the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, said that there's just something about the order of creation that means that God intends for the preaching voice to be a male voice. Did you hear that, right? Like the isness, the fact that Southern Baptists don't allow female preachers, they're mistaking for the oughtness. They're claiming that it's God, it's the order of creation that makes it that way, not human injustice and human sin. And many people today hold this same view economically, right? Blaming poor people for their poverty, assuming that someone with wealth has that wealth because they have somehow earned it. Which is not to say that some poor people have not made mistakes in money management, and certainly not to say that some rich people haven't worked really hard, but the isness of the wealth, how much wealth someone has, is decided by many, many factors and economic and social structures beyond any kind of personal worthiness or virtue. Jesus' parable contradicts this idea that people deserve their economic status. As we see Lazarus sheltered in the bosom of Abraham while the rich man is in the flames suffering, it becomes clear that God does not, in fact, favor the rich man. The situations of the two men on earth were a result of circumstantial accidents, not God's divine intention. And so in addition to sharing our food and our other resources with people in need, I believe this parable also calls us to address the systems that create the disparities between the haves and the have-nots in the first place. It is a call to mercy for the person at the gate and a call to justice to try to improve and change the systems that allow someone to be starving at the gate while someone else feasts sumptuously every day inside. As I read and I contemplate this parable, it feels like the rich man's final request was granted after all, that in a sense, Lazarus has come back to tell us all and to warn us about this great chasm and to encourage us to bridge the gaps while we can here on earth. I don't often issue direct challenges in my sermons, but I want to encourage you all this week to choose, not try to do everything, but choose one thing. Think about intention or compassion or justice, and see if you can increase one of those, your work towards one of those things in your life this week as a step of faith, as a way of being more faithful in general and particularly in living out Jesus' teachings in this parable. You don't have to do it all, but you are invited to commit to doing something.